Carl Jung believed that most people live their lives without ever becoming who they actually are. They become functional. They become adapted. They become acceptable. But they do not become whole. He called the process that leads toward wholeness individuation. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not optimization. It is not becoming better in the eyes of others. It is the gradual realization of what the psyche already contains. This realization is not comfortable. Individuation begins where adaptation ends. It starts at the point where the strategies that once worked begin to fail. Roles lose meaning. Goals feel hollow. Success feels strangely empty. Nothing is obviously wrong, and yet something essential is missing. Jung observed that individuation often begins with disorientation. The ego, having identified itself with roles, achievements, and social identity, encounters a loss of inner coherence. The question arises quietly at first, is this all there is? This question is not philosophical. It is existential. Individuation does not announce itself as a calling. It arrives as a disturbance. What once provided direction no longer satisfies. What once felt certain begins to feel borrowed. The ego resists this disturbance. Resistance is natural. The ego was built to survive, not to transform. Its task was adaptation to family, culture, expectations, and necessity. Individuation asks the ego to loosen its grip on these adaptations. This feels dangerous. To the ego, individuation resembles loss. Loss of certainty, loss of identity, loss of direction. Jung emphasized that individuation does not destroy the ego, it relativizes it. The ego is no longer the center of the psyche, it becomes one function among others. The shift is threatening. The ego prefers control. Individuation requires surrender not to chaos, but to a larger organizing principle within the psyche, which Jung called the self. The self is not the ego's ideal version of itself. It is the totality of the psyche, including what the ego has ignored, rejected, or never developed. Individuation is the process of bringing these neglected aspects into conscious relationship. This relationship is not harmonious at first. It is conflicted. The psyche does not unfold smoothly. It confronts the ego with contradictions. Qualities the ego disown return. Desires once suppressed demand recognition. Meaning shifts. Jung believed that individuation cannot be chosen in the way careers or lifestyles are chosen. It is not initiated by ambition. It is initiated by necessity. When the old way of living no longer works psychologically, the psyche begins to reorganize itself. Individuation is this reorganization. Many people mistake this phase for failure. They feel behind. They feel lost. They feel disconnected from the life they built. Jung saw this not as regression, but as a turning point. The psyche is not breaking down. It is turning inward. This inward turn is unfamiliar. The ego is trained to look outward for validation, direction, and meaning. Individuation reverses this orientation. Meaning must now be discovered internally. This discovery is slower. It lacks external confirmation. It often feels lonely. Jung emphasized that individuation separates people psychologically even when their external lives remain unchanged. Two people may share the same job, family, and environment, yet live entirely different inner lives. One lives through adaptation, the other begins to live through integration. Integration does not reject the world, it changes the relationship to it. The world no longer defines the self, it becomes a context rather than an authority. Values shift, priorities reorder themselves. What once seemed urgent loses importance, what once seemed irrelevant gains weight. This reordering feels unsettling. The ego struggles to orient itself without familiar markers. Jung believed that this disorientation is unavoidable. It signals that the psyche is no longer satisfied with borrowed meaning. The individual is being asked to discover a more authentic orientation. Authenticity here does not mean comfort, it means alignment. Alignment between conscious life and unconscious reality. Individuation demands honesty, not moral honesty, but psychological honesty. The willingness to see what is actually present in the psyche rather than what should be present. This honesty is rare. It threatens the image the ego has constructed, which is why individuation is often delayed until crisis forces it. Jung noted that many people encounter individuation during midlife, when earlier goals have been achieved or revealed as insufficient. But individuation is not limited to age. It appears whenever adaptation exhausts itself. The beginning of individuation does not feel like growth. It feels like loss of direction. But this loss is deceptive. The old direction was external. The psyche is now seeking its own center. That center is not the ego. And discovering this fact changes everything. When the ego is no longer the unquestioned ruler of the psyche, life stops being a performance and begins to become a dialogue. A dialogue between what you think you are and what you actually are. Individuation begins with this tension, not with answers, with questions that refuse to disappear. And once those questions appear, the psyche does not return to sleep. It has begun to move toward itself. Individuation rarely begins in comfort. Carl Jung observed that the psyche usually turns inward only when the structures that supported the ego begin to fail. What collapses is not life itself, but the meaning that once held life together. This collapse can take many forms. A career that no longer satisfies, a relationship that feels empty despite stability, a sense of success that feels strangely hollow. From the outside, everything may look intact. Internally, coherence is gone. The ego experiences this as confusion. The rules it learned no longer apply. Effort produces diminishing returns. Motivation fades. The future feels vague rather than promising. Jung believed this state is often misinterpreted as pathology. People assume something is wrong with them. They search for fixes. They try to restore the old orientation. But individuation does not move backward. The psyche has withdrawn energy from previous investments. What once mattered no longer carries the same charge. This withdrawal feels like depression, apathy, or restlessness. Jung saw this not as failure, but as the psyche is disengaging from forms that no longer serve its development. The ego resists this disengagement. It clings to identity. It doubles down on effort. It tries to force meaning back into familiar structures. This resistance intensifies suffering. The more the ego tries to restore the old order, the more exhausted it becomes. Jung emphasized that this exhaustion is significant. It weakens the ego's grip. Only a weakened ego can be relativized. Individuation requires the ego to relinquish its claim to centrality. As long as the ego believes it knows what life should be, the psyche remains subordinate. Collapse undermines this belief. The ego no longer feels authoritative. This loss of authority is frightening. Without familiar goals, the ego feels exposed. It lacks orientation. Anxiety increases. Old defenses become unreliable. The psyche is entering unfamiliar territory. Jung compared this phase to a descent. Consciousness moves away from the surface of life and into deeper layers of experience. This descent is not chosen, it happens. Dreams often intensify during this period. Symbols appear, images recur. The unconscious begins to speak more loudly as the ego's dominance weakens. Jung believed this is because the psyche seeks balance. When the ego over-identifies with adaptation roles, productivity, success, the unconscious compensates by introducing material that disrupts that identification. Disruption restores equilibrium. But equilibrium feels like loss when it first appears. The ego mourns what no longer works. This mourning is necessary. Without it, the psyche cannot disengage fully from the old orientation. Grief clears space. Space allows something new to emerge. Jung emphasized that this phase is not about replacing one identity with another. It is about allowing identity itself to become fluid. Fluidity threatens control. Control is the ego's primary strategy. Individuation asks the ego to tolerate not knowing. This tolerance is difficult. The ego prefers anxiety with direction over calm without it. But the psyche will not supply direction prematurely. It requires the ego to remain in uncertainty. Jung believed that remaining in uncertainty is one of the most transformative capacities a person can develop. It allows unconscious material to surface without being immediately organized or rejected. This openness feels passive. It is not, it is attentive. During this phase, people often feel disconnected from others. Old conversations feel superficial. Shared goals no longer resonate. Isolation increases. This isolation is psychological, not necessarily social. The individual is no longer oriented toward collective values alone. The psyche is reorganizing around something more personal. Jung warned against interpreting this withdrawal as selfishness. It is not a rejection of others. It is a turn inward. This inward turn can be frightening because it lacks clear landmarks. The ego is accustomed to measuring progress externally. Individuation removes those measurements. Progress becomes internal. Internal progress is subtle. It often feels invisible. This invisibility leads many people to abandon the process prematurely. They force themselves back into adaptation. They seek distraction. They numb the discomfort. Jung believed that when individuation is avoided, symptoms return. The psyche will repeat the collapse until the ego listens. This repetition is not punishment. It is insistence. The psyche insists on development. Development here does not mean improvement. It means alignment. Alignment between conscious life and unconscious truth. Collapse exposes misalignment. The ego experiences this exposure as instability. The psyche experiences it as opportunity. Opportunity is not pleasant. It is demanding. Jung believed that individuation begins not when answers appear, but when the ego can no longer avoid the questions. These questions do not shout. They linger. They undermine certainty. They dissolve old motivations. And in that dissolution, the psyche prepares the ground for something more authentic to emerge. Not yet visible, not yet defined, but already present, waiting for the ego to stop resisting what it has already outgrown. Individuation does not fail because it is impossible. It stalls because the ego resists it. Carl Jung was clear that the ego's resistance is not pathological. It is structural. The ego was formed to adapt, to maintain continuity, and to protect the individual from disintegration. Wholeness threatens all three. The ego prefers clarity. Wholeness introduces contradiction. As individuation progresses, qualities that were previously disowned begin to surface. Traits the ego worked hard to suppress: aggression, dependency, vulnerability, ambition, creativity appear with urgency. The ego experiences this as regression. It feels like losing control, but what is actually happening is expansion. Expansion overwhelms the ego's existing structure. Identity begins to loosen. Self-descriptions no longer fit cleanly. The person feels unfamiliar to themselves. This unfamiliarity is unsettling. The ego responds by tightening. It rationalizes. It dismisses what does not align with its self-image. Jung believed this tightening is the most common reason individuation stalls. The ego attempts to incorporate unconscious material without allowing itself to be transformed by it. It wants addition without alteration. But individuation does not add. It reorganizes. The ego's fear is understandable. Wholeness means relinquishing superiority. The ego must accept that it is not the ruler of the psyche, only a participant. This feels humiliating. Humiliation is not social embarrassment here. It is psychological leveling. The ego loses its privileged position. Jung emphasized that many people mistake this leveling for weakness. In reality, it is a precondition for strength. A psyche dominated by the ego is rigid. A psyche in dialogue is resilient. Resistance also appears as urgency. The ego wants resolution, it wants clarity restored, it wants to get through the process. Individuation does not move at the ego's pace. Attempts to accelerate it lead to distortion. Insights are grasped prematurely. Symbols are interpreted literally. The ego inflates itself with unconscious material. Jung called this inflation. Inflation feels powerful. It is dangerous. The ego identifies with archetypal forces rather than relating to them. Instead of dialogue, possession occurs. The individual feels special, chosen, or uniquely enlightened. This is not individuation. It is collapse disguised as transcendence. Jung warned that inflation often appears after periods of collapse. The ego swings from disorientation to grandiosity. Both are defenses against genuine integration. True individuation is quieter. It does not announce itself. It requires patience. Patience frustrates the ego. The ego measures progress by external markers. Individuation offers none. The only evidence is subtle. Increased tolerance for ambiguity, reduced reactivity, deeper responsibility. These changes do not feel heroic. They feel ordinary. The ego resists ordinariness. It wants distinction. Jung believed that individuation dismantles the fantasy of uniqueness. What emerges instead is particularity of specific, embodied life shaped by real limits. This is less glamorous. It is more real. Resistance also appears as fear of moral collapse. The ego worries that acknowledging darker impulses will lead to acting them out. Jung rejected this fear. He believed that what is acknowledged becomes regulated. What is denied becomes autonomous. Integration does not unleash chaos. It contains it, but containment requires strength. Strength is built gradually. The ego wants guarantees. Individuation offers none. This lack of guarantee keeps resistance alive. The ego negotiates. It accepts some insights while rejecting others. It integrates what flatters and avoids what threatens. Partial integration creates imbalance. Imbalance produces symptoms. Symptoms signal unfinished work. Jung emphasized that individuation cannot be selective. The psyche does not offer only what is comfortable. It presents what is necessary. The ego's task is not approval. It is engagement. Engagement requires courage. Courage here is not bravado. It is endurance. Endurance of uncertainty. Endurance of contradiction. Endurance of humility. These are not virtues celebrated by culture. They are demanded by the psyche. Jung believed that individuation succeeds when the ego stops trying to control the process and begins to cooperate with it. Cooperation does not mean passivity. It means attentive participation. The ego listens. It responds. It adjusts. It does not dominate. Resistance softens when the ego realizes that wholeness does not erase identity. It transforms it. The self that emerges is not dissolved. It is repositioned. The ego becomes a center of consciousness, not the center of being. This repositioning reduces anxiety. Control loosens. Life feels less like a project and more like a dialogue. Resistance fades not when the ego is defeated, but when it understands that it is no longer alone in the psyche. There is something larger at work, something that does not oppose the ego, but exceeds it. Individuation advances when the ego stops asking how to remain intact and begins asking how to remain honest. Honesty is not cruel. It is stabilizing. And when honesty replaces resistance, wholeness stops feeling like a threat. It begins to feel like a direction. Individuation does not mean plunging blindly into the unconscious. Carl Jung was explicit about this. The unconscious is not a place of unlimited wisdom. It contains creativity, but also chaos. Approaching it without preparation leads not to wholeness, but to fragmentation. The task of individuation is relationship, not immersion. The ego must learn to engage unconscious material without identifying with it. This distinction is crucial. Identification leads to possession. Relationship allows dialogue. Possession overwhelms. Dialogue informs. Jung believed that many people mistake intense inner experience for progress. Powerful emotions, vivid dreams, and symbolic imagery can feel transformative. They are not, by themselves, evidence of individuation. What matters is not intensity, it is integration. Integration requires the ego to remain present. The ego must not dissolve into unconscious content, nor suppress it. It must stand in between. This standing is difficult. The unconscious speaks in images, effects, and impulses. The ego speaks in concepts, values, and decisions. Individuation asks these languages to interact without one dominating the other. When the ego is weak, unconscious material floods consciousness. Anxiety, confusion, and loss of orientation follow. When the ego is rigid, unconscious material is ignored or dismissed. Both extremes block development. Jung emphasized the importance of containment. Containment is the ego's ability to hold inner experience without acting it out or pushing it away. It is a psychological vessel. This vessel is built slowly. Containment develops through reflection, not reaction. When an impulse arises, the ego notices it. It does not immediately obey or reject it. It asks what it represents. Asking does not guarantee answers. It creates space. Space prevents possession. Jung believed that symbols play a vital role here. Symbols mediate between ego and unconscious. They translate raw psychic energy into forms that can be contemplated. Dreams, images, fantasies, these are not instructions. They are communications. The ego's task is interpretation without literalization. Taking symbols literally leads to confusion. Ignoring them leads to stagnation. Interpretation requires humility. The ego must accept that it does not fully understand what it encounters. Premature certainty closes dialogue. This is why Jung warned against forcing meaning. Meaning unfolds gradually as symbols are lived with rather than decoded immediately. Living with a symbol means allowing it to influence attitude without dictating action. It becomes a background orientation rather than a command. This subtle influence stabilizes the process. Without containment, individuation accelerates dangerously. The person feels flooded by insight, emotion, or significance. The ego inflates or collapses. Jung saw many cases where premature confrontation with the unconscious led to breakdown rather than growth. Individuation is not heroic conquest. It is measured engagement. The ego must remain grounded in ordinary life. Work, relationships, and responsibility provide structure. This structure anchors consciousness. Without it, the psyche drifts. Individuation does not remove one from life. It deepens participation in it. Jung believed that the unconscious reveals itself only to the extent that the ego can bear it. What emerges is proportional to psychological readiness. This proportionality protects the psyche. It also frustrates the ego. The ego wants completion. The psyche offers sequence. Sequence unfolds over time. Time cannot be bypassed. Meeting the unconscious without being overwhelmed requires patience. Patience allows the ego to develop resilience. Resilience allows the psyche to reveal more without destabilizing the whole. This rhythm cannot be forced. Jung believed that respecting this rhythm is one of the most difficult tasks of individuation. The ego is accustomed to control. The unconscious responds to respect. Respect here does not mean reverence. It means restraint. Restraint keeps dialogue alive. When restraint is absent, the unconscious dominates. When restraint is present, it collaborates. Collaboration transforms. Transformation here is not dramatic. It is cumulative. Over time, the ego becomes less threatened by inner experience. Anxiety decreases. Curiosity increases. The psyche feels less divided. This does not mean conflict disappears. It becomes manageable. The ego no longer panics when contradictions arise. It recognizes them as signals rather than threats. This recognition marks a shift. The unconscious is no longer an adversary. It becomes a partner. Partnership is the foundation of individuation. Without it, the journey turns into either avoidance or collapse. With it, the psyche begins to reorganize itself organically, revealing layers only when the ego is ready to meet them. Not as conqueror, as participant. That participation is what allows wholeness to emerge without destroying the life that must carry it. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about individuation is the belief that it makes a person exceptional. Carl Jung warned repeatedly against this illusion. Individuation does not elevate the ego above others. It does not confer superiority. It does not make life extraordinary in appearance. In fact, it often does the opposite. As individuation progresses, the fantasy of being special begins to dissolve. The ego relinquishes its need to stand apart through identity, ideology, or distinction. What emerges instead is something quieter and more demanding: specificity. Jung believed that maturity is not about uniqueness in the abstract, but about becoming this person living this life within real limits. Individuation strips away borrowed identities and inflated self-concepts. This feels disappointing to the ego. The ego prefers ideals. Ideals feel clean and expansive. Reality feels constrained, but wholeness requires constraint. Without limits, identity becomes imaginary. Individuation grounds the psyche in actuality rather than aspiration. The individual stops asking, "Who could I be?" and begins asking, "Who am I, given what is real?" This shift reduces grandiosity. It also reduces despair. When the ego no longer measures itself against fantasies, it becomes less brittle. Failure loses its catastrophic quality. Success loses its intoxicating pull. Life becomes less dramatic. Jung believed this reduction in drama is a sign of progress, not stagnation. Drama often compensates for inner imbalance. When the psyche stabilizes, intensity decreases. This can feel like loss. Many people abandon individuation at this stage. They mistake the absence of excitement for emptiness. They return to old patterns: conflict, idealization, or ambition to feel alive again. Jung saw this as a refusal to accept ordinariness. Ordinariness is not mediocrity. It is embodiment. Embodiment means living within the body, the moment, and the limits of circumstance. Individuation draws consciousness downward, out of abstraction and into lived experience. This descent frustrates the ego. The ego prefers elevation. Elevation feels spiritual. Grounding feels mundane. But Jung insisted that genuine psychological development moves downward before it moves upward. The psyche must be rooted before it can expand without distortion. Individuation therefore reduces pretension. People become less certain about their moral superiority, their insight, or their destiny. They speak more cautiously. They listen more. This humility is not self-doubt. It is accuracy. Accuracy replaces self-image with self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is less flattering. It is also more stable. Jung believed that many psychological crises arise from the gap between who a person imagines themselves to be and who they actually are. Individuation closes this gap. Closing it feels like shrinking. In reality, it is consolidation. The psyche becomes more coherent. Energy once spent maintaining illusion becomes available for living. Attention shifts from performance to participation. Participation does not require applause. It requires presence. As individuation continues, comparison loses relevance. The individual is less preoccupied with others' paths. Envy fades. Resentment softens. Not because the person becomes indifferent, but because their life feels more internally anchored. This anchoring reduces the need for validation. Validation is external regulation. Individuation builds internal regulation. Internal regulation allows choice. Choice replaces compulsion. Jung believed that a truly individuated person is often unremarkable from the outside. They may hold ordinary jobs, live ordinary lives, and possess no visible markers of distinction. What distinguishes them is not appearance. It is orientation. They are oriented toward inner truth rather than external approval. Their decisions are guided less by expectation and more by congruence. Congruence feels calm. Calm feels dull to a culture addicted to stimulation. But calm allows endurance. Endurance matters more than excitement over a lifetime. Individuation does not make life easier, it makes it inhabitable. When the fantasy of specialness dissolves, something more reliable emerges. A sense of rightness that does not depend on comparison, a direction that does not require admiration. This direction is subtle. It often reveals itself only in hindsight. Jung believed that individuation can only be recognized retrospectively. While living it, the individual often feels uncertain, unremarkable, and incomplete. This is not failure. It is fidelity to reality. Reality does not dramatize itself. It unfolds. Individuation aligns the psyche with that unfolding. The reward is not transcendence. It is belonging to one's own life. Without inflation, without illusion, without the need to be more than what is actually possible. That belonging is not glamorous. It is grounding. And grounding is what allows the psyche to remain whole in a world that constantly tempts it to fragment itself for recognition. Individuation does not make you special. It makes you real. And being real is far rarer and far more demanding than being admired. Individuation is sustained by meaning, but not the kind that is inherited, borrowed, or imposed. Carl Jung believed that the psyche cannot develop without meaning, yet meaning cannot be manufactured by the ego. It emerges indirectly through lived experience, tension, and reflection. This is why individuation often feels directionless at first. Old meanings dissolve before new ones appear. The ego is accustomed to goals that promise reward status, security, approval, success. These goals organize effort and provide motivation. When individuation begins, these motivations lose their force. The ego feels unmotivated. Jung saw this not as laziness, but as withdrawal of psychic energy. The psyche is no longer willing to invest in meanings that do not correspond to its deeper structure. This withdrawal creates emptiness. Emptiness is uncomfortable. The ego attempts to fill it quickly. It searches for new beliefs, new identities, or new explanations. It wants replacement meaning. Individuation resists replacement. Meaning must grow, not be chosen. Jung emphasized that meaning during individuation is often symbolic rather than conceptual. It appears through images, dreams, recurring themes, or emotional patterns rather than clear narratives. The psyche speaks indirectly. The ego prefers clarity. This mismatch creates frustration. People often ask, "What am I supposed to do?" The psyche responds with experiences, not instructions. This frustrates the ego's problem-solving orientation. Jung believed that enduring this frustration is essential. Premature meaning closes the process. It substitutes belief for understanding. Belief feels stable. Understanding evolves. Individuation requires evolving meaning. As the process continues, small moments begin to feel significant not because they promise reward, but because they feel congruent. Certain actions feel aligned. Certain choices feel quietly right. This sense of rightness is subtle. It lacks enthusiasm. It also lacks doubt. Jung described this as the emergence of inner authority. Authority here does not command. It orients. Orientation replaces motivation. Motivation is external. Orientation is internal. The individual stops asking what will bring fulfillment and begins noticing what drains or sustains vitality. Life is organized less by ambition and more by resonance. This shift is difficult to articulate. Others may not understand it. The individual may not fully understand it either. Jung believed that meaning during individuation is validated through endurance, not excitement. What persists without reinforcement carries significance. Fads fade, trends lose appeal, what remains is quieter. This quietness often feels lonely. The individual no longer shares the same motivational language as those around them. Conversations about success, urgency, or competition feel distant. This distance is not superiority. It is divergence. Divergence is uncomfortable. It can produce guilt. Jung warned that guilt often arises when an individual no longer lives according to collective expectations. The psyche pulls inward while the world pulls outward. Individuation does not eliminate this tension. It reframes it. Meaning becomes something lived rather than justified. The individual stops explaining themselves and begins inhabiting their choices. This inhabiting strengthens coherence. Coherence does not require certainty. It requires alignment. Alignment allows the psyche to tolerate uncertainty without collapse. Jung believed that when meaning is authentic, it does not need defense. It does not convert others. It does not demand agreement. It simply sustains life. This sustainability distinguishes individuation from ideology. Ideology needs reinforcement. Individuation does not. Meaning that emerges from individuation adapts over time. It deepens, contracts, and reorients as life changes. It remains responsive rather than fixed. Responsiveness keeps the psyche alive. Fixed meaning hardens. Hardening precedes stagnation. Jung saw stagnation as one of the greatest psychological dangers. A life with fixed meaning may appear stable, but internally it loses vitality. Individuation protects against stagnation by keeping meaning provisional. Provisional meaning is not fragile. It is flexible. Flexibility allows renewal. As individuation progresses, meaning becomes less about why and more about how. How one lives, how one responds, how one bears difficulty. These questions ground meaning in behavior rather than belief. Behavior reveals alignment more honestly than thought. Jung believed that individuation culminates not in answers, but in a way of living that feels internally consistent. Meaning is not something the individual possesses. It is something the individual enacts. This enactment does not resolve all conflict. It gives conflict context. Context reduces despair. Despair thrives in meaninglessness. Individuation does not eliminate despair. It gives it a place where suffering is not wasted, confusion is not failure, and uncertainty is not pathology. Meaning emerges when the psyche feels heard not by others, by the ego itself. When the ego learns to listen without demanding explanation, meaning begins to grow quietly in the background of life, not as certainty, as orientation. And orientation is enough to keep moving forward, even when the destination remains unknown. Individuation often becomes unavoidable in midlife. Carl Jung noticed a recurring pattern. The psychological strategies that carried a person through the first half of life begin to fail in the second. Early life is oriented toward expansion. Education, career, relationships, achievement, identity. The psyche invests energy outward. Midlife marks a shift. What once motivated no longer satisfies. Goals lose urgency. Success feels thinner. The future feels shorter. Not because of fear of death, but because time becomes psychologically visible. This visibility changes priorities. Jung believed midlife crisis is not a breakdown. It is a reversal of direction. The psyche begins withdrawing energy from outward adaptation and redirecting it inward. This withdrawal feels like loss. Motivation drops. Confidence wavers. The ego feels less certain of its role. The ego interprets this as failure. The psyche experiences it as correction. The first half of life is about building a strong ego. Without this foundation, individuation cannot occur. The second half asks that ego to relinquish its dominance. This relinquishment feels threatening. People often attempt to resolve this tension by clinging to youth, status, or stimulation. New ambitions are adopted. New identities are tried on. The ego attempts to restart expansion. Jung saw this as avoidance. Avoidance prolongs suffering. The psyche is not asking for more achievement, it is asking for integration. Midlife intensifies unconscious material. Dreams become more symbolic. Emotions deepen. Old conflicts resurface. The shadow demands recognition. This resurgence is not regression. It is return. Return of what was postponed. Jung believed that what is not lived consciously in the first half of life must be faced in the second. The psyche insists on balance. If adaptation dominated earlier life, reflection now demands space. If ambition ruled, meaning now questions its cost. This questioning destabilizes identity. Who am I without my roles? What remains when striving slows? These questions unsettle the ego. They also open possibility. Midlife individuation often involves mourning, not only mourning youth, but mourning unlived lives. Paths not taken, potentials abandoned. This mourning is painful. It is also honest. Jung believed that mourning is essential for psychological renewal. It clears space for what can still be lived authentically rather than nostalgically. Nostalgia traps energy in the past. Individuation redirects it toward the present. Midlife also confronts finitude. The psyche becomes aware that life is not endless. This awareness sharpens values. What is superficial loses appeal. What is essential gains weight. This sharpening feels sobering. It is clarifying. Jung believed that individuation in midlife often leads to simplification. Life becomes less crowded. Relationships become fewer but deeper. Activities become chosen rather than accumulated. This simplification can look like withdrawal. It is actually consolidation. Consolidation strengthens coherence. Many resist this phase because it does not promise external reward. The culture offers little guidance here. Productivity, youth, and expansion remain celebrated. Individuation moves in the opposite direction. It deepens rather than accelerates. Those who follow it often feel out of sync with their environment. This dissonance is uncomfortable. Jung believed that enduring this dissonance is necessary. Individuation requires tolerating isolation without becoming bitter or superior. Isolation without meaning becomes despair. Isolation with purpose becomes depth. Midlife individuation is not about abandoning life. It is about inhabiting it differently. The ego learns to serve rather than dominate. Authority shifts inward. Decisions become guided by alignment rather than ambition. This shift does not eliminate difficulty. It changes its quality. Problems become more personal and less performative. Success becomes quieter. Failure becomes less catastrophic. Life feels smaller. It also feels truer. Jung believed that the second half of life is psychologically wasted. If the ego continues to pursue the goals of the first half, expansion without integration leads to emptiness. Individuation offers an alternative. It asks the individual to turn inward, not to escape the world, but to meet it with greater coherence. This coherence is not dramatic, it is steady. Midlife individuation does not produce transformation overnight. It unfolds gradually, often unnoticed. Only later does the individual realize that their orientation has changed. What once felt central no longer dominates. What once felt threatening no longer overwhelms. The psyche settles into a rhythm. This rhythm supports endurance. Endurance matters more than intensity as life progresses. Jung believed that individuation in midlife prepares the psyche for aging without despair. It builds inner resources that do not depend on achievement or validation. These resources sustain meaning when external supports diminish. Midlife is not the end of becoming. It is the moment becoming turns inward. When embraced, this turn does not shrink life. It deepens it. Depth, not expansion, is what allows the psyche to remain whole as time becomes finite. That is why individuation often waits for midlife. Not because youth is incapable, but because the psyche must first learn who it is before it can learn how to let go of that image. Only then can wholeness begin to take precedence over success. And only then does life begin to feel complete without needing to feel full. As individuation deepens, relationships change. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation does not isolate a person from others. It alters the basis of connection. Relationships no longer exist primarily to stabilize identity, regulate emotion, or confirm self-worth. They become encounters between differentiated selves. This shift is subtle but profound. Earlier in life, relationships often serve compensatory functions. One person carries what the other lacks. Projection fills the gaps. Roles emerge naturally. The strong one, the dependent one, the caretaker, the achiever. These arrangements feel natural. They are also limiting. As individuation progresses, projections begin to withdraw. The other person is no longer required to carry unconscious material. This changes the emotional economy of the relationship. Intensity decreases. Dependency loosens. Conflict becomes clearer. This clarity can feel like distance. Jung believed many relationships fail at this stage, not because love disappears, but because projection ends. What once felt magical now feels ordinary. The ego interprets this as loss. In reality, it is contact with reality. Reality lacks enchantment. It offers truth. Truth requires adjustment. Partners must renegotiate who they are to each other without the scaffolding of unconscious expectation. This renegotiation is demanding. Some relationships deepen. Others dissolve. Jung did not see this as failure. He saw it as consequence. Relationships that survive individuation are no longer held together by illusion. They are held together by choice. Choice replaces compulsion. Compulsion fueled intensity. Choice requires responsibility. This responsibility can feel heavy, but it is also freeing. Individuated relationships allow disagreement without annihilation. Differences are tolerated rather than interpreted as threat. Emotional reactions are owned rather than displaced. Ownership reduces drama. Drama often substitutes for intimacy. As drama fades, intimacy changes form. It becomes quieter, less consuming, more spacious. Space allows each person to remain themselves without constant negotiation. Jung believed that individuation allows genuine community. Without it, people gather around shared projections, enemies, ideals, identities. With it, connection is based on reality rather than fantasy. Reality-based connection is less intoxicating. It is more sustainable. The individuated person no longer needs others to validate their inner life. They share it without demanding agreement. They listen without attempting to convert. This stance can feel alienating. Not everyone wants to relate without projection. Some relationships depend on mutual blindness. Individuation disrupts this arrangement. Jung believed this disruption is unavoidable. Growth changes the terms of connection. The question is not whether relationships change, but whether they are allowed to evolve. Those that evolve gain depth. Those that resist fracture. This fracture is painful. It also prevents stagnation. Individuation does not guarantee harmony with others. It guarantees honesty with oneself. That honesty reconfigures how connection is experienced. The individuated person becomes less reactive. Triggers lose intensity. Boundaries become clearer. Empathy increases, but not at the expense of self-abandonment. This balance is difficult. It requires continuous adjustment. Jung believed that mature relationship is one of the most demanding achievements of individuation. It requires holding both autonomy and connection simultaneously. Most people sacrifice one for the other. Individuation refuses that sacrifice. It insists on both. This insistence creates tension. Tension is not pathology. It is structure. Structure allows relationship to endure without collapse or fusion. As individuation continues, social life may narrow, not because of rejection, but because superficial connection loses appeal. Fewer relationships carry more weight. This narrowing feels lonely at times. Loneliness is the cost of authenticity. Jung did not romanticize this cost. He acknowledged it, but he believed the alternative, living through projection and dependence, costs more in the long run. Individuated relationships are not free of conflict. They are free of illusion. Freedom from illusion allows forgiveness without denial and distance without hatred. These capacities deepen connection. Individuation does not remove the need for others. It changes why they are needed, no longer to complete what is missing, but to share what is present. That sharing is less dramatic than longing. It is also more real. In reality, once chosen, becomes the ground upon which both self and relationship can stand without collapsing into each other. This is how individuation reshapes connection, not by reducing love, but by stripping it of the unconscious demands that once distorted it. What remains is quieter. It is also more durable. One of the deepest fears surrounding individuation is the fear of being alone. Carl Jung understood this fear well. Individuation separates the individual psychologically before it ever separates them socially. The person begins to experience themselves as inwardly distinct, even when outward life remains unchanged. This inner separation feels like isolation. The ego equates belonging with similarity. To belong has meant to share values, goals, beliefs, and rhythms with others. Individuation disrupts this similarity. The individual's inner orientation shifts while the outer world remains largely the same. This mismatch produces anxiety. If I no longer see the world the same way, where do I belong? Jung believed this question is unavoidable. Individuation cannot occur without risking psychological loneliness. The individual steps away from collective identity without yet knowing what will replace it. This is a liminal state. The old belonging no longer fits. The new belonging has not yet formed. The ego experiences this as abandonment, but the psyche experiences it as differentiation. Differentiation is not rejection of others. It is the development of inner position. Without position, the self dissolves into the collective. With position, connection becomes choice rather than fusion. Jung emphasized that many people abandon individuation at this stage because the fear of isolation feels unbearable. They return to familiar beliefs, roles, or relationships to regain the sense of belonging. This return restores comfort. It also restores unconsciousness. Individuation demands tolerating the space between separation and connection. This space feels empty because it is no longer filled with borrowed identity. Emptiness is not absence. It is openness. The psyche uses this openness to reorganize itself. Jung believed that new forms of connection emerge only after this period is endured. These connections are fewer, but more genuine. They are based on resonance rather than conformity. Resonance cannot be forced. It appears gradually. During this phase, the individual often feels misunderstood. Language no longer matches shared assumptions. Conversations feel shallow or strained. The person may withdraw, not out of superiority, but out of fatigue. This withdrawal is often misinterpreted as arrogance. Jung warned against both interpretations, arrogance and pathology. The individuating person is not better than others. They are simply no longer identical. Difference disrupts harmony. Harmony based on sameness was fragile. Individuation replaces it with harmony based on mutual recognition. This recognition requires patience. The fear of isolation also arises because individuation removes external validation. The individual can no longer rely on collective approval to confirm their inner truth. Authority shifts inward. This shift feels dangerous. What if I am wrong? Jung believed this question is essential. Inner authority without humility becomes dogma. Individuation requires holding authority and doubt simultaneously. This balance is difficult. The ego wants certainty. The psyche demands honesty. Honesty includes uncertainty. Living without constant reassurance builds inner stability. Stability reduces dependence on external validation. This independence can feel lonely at first. Over time, it becomes grounding. Jung emphasized that individuation does not culminate in isolation. It culminates in belonging without loss of self. The individual reconnects with others from a position of differentiation. This reconnection is not dramatic. It feels natural. The fear of isolation subsides as the individual realizes that separation was temporary. It served a purpose to allow the psyche to consolidate itself. Once consolidated, connection resumes on new terms. These terms include boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are conditions for encounter. Without boundaries, there is fusion. Fusion destroys individuality. With boundaries, relationship becomes possible. Jung believed that the ability to tolerate solitude is a sign of psychological maturity. Solitude here does not mean the absence of relationship. It means the capacity to remain oneself without constant reflection in others. This capacity stabilizes connection. People who fear solitude often cling. Clinging suffocates relationship. Individuation reduces clinging by strengthening inner anchoring. Anchoring reduces desperation. Desperation fuels illusion. Illusion blocks reality. As individuation deepens, the individual becomes less afraid of being misunderstood. Misunderstanding no longer threatens identity. The self does not require universal recognition. This freedom reduces resentment. Resentment often arises from unacknowledged dependence on approval. Individuation dissolves this dependence gradually. Jung believed that society depends on individuated individuals. Without them, collective life stagnates. With them, new values, perspectives, and possibilities emerge. But individuation always begins in isolation. Not because the world rejects the individual, but because the individual must first learn to stand without leaning. Only then can connection become mutual rather than compensatory. The fear of isolation is therefore not a warning sign. It is a threshold. Crossing it does not lead to abandonment. It leads to a different form of belonging, one that does not require self-erasure. That belonging is quieter. It is also stronger. And it allows the individual to participate in the world without disappearing into it. That is the paradox, Jung believed, lay at the heart of individuation. Only by risking separation does the psyche become capable of genuine connection. Without that risk, life remains crowded, but inwardly alone. With it, life becomes more spacious, genuinely shared. Individuation is not a destination. Carl Jung insisted on this point. There is no moment when the psyche becomes complete, resolved, or finished. Wholeness is not an achievement. It is a way of relating to inner life. The ego often expects closure. Individuation offers continuity. This difference matters. When individuation is misunderstood as an endpoint, the ego turns it into another project. Progress is measured. Identity reforms around being developed. The psyche is once again subordinated to image. Jung rejected this. He believed that individuation unfolds as long as life unfolds. New situations activate new material. Each life stage reveals aspects of the psyche that were previously irrelevant or dormant. What was integrated at one stage may require reworking at another. This does not indicate failure. It indicates life. Individuation, therefore, demands ongoing attention. The ego must repeatedly adjust its relationship to unconscious material. Old certainties loosen. New contradictions appear. The psyche does not stabilize permanently. It rebalances. Rebalancing requires flexibility. Flexibility requires humility. Humility here means recognizing that consciousness is partial. The ego never sees the whole psyche at once. It encounters fragments, symbols, and signals over time. Individuation teaches the ego to listen rather than conclude. Listening does not mean passivity. It means responsiveness. Jung believed that psychological health is not the absence of conflict, but the capacity to remain conscious within it. Individuation strengthens this capacity. Conflicts become signals rather than crises. Emotional reactions become information rather than commands. Dreams become messages rather than distractions. This shift reduces urgency. Urgency fuels impulsive action. Reduced urgency allows choice. Choice is the practical outcome of individuation. Without choice, insight remains theoretical. Jung emphasized that individuation must be lived, not contemplated. It expresses itself in daily decisions how one works, relates, rests, and responds to difficulty. These expressions are often subtle. Others may not notice them. The individual feels them. Life begins to feel internally consistent, even when circumstances are difficult. This consistency is not comfort. It is coherence. Coherence allows endurance. Endurance matters because individuation does not remove suffering. It reframes it. Suffering becomes part of a larger psychological narrative rather than meaningless disruption. Meaning here does not justify pain. It contextualizes it. Context reduces despair. Jung believed that people often abandon individuation because it does not reward quickly. There is no applause, no certificate, no final insight that resolves everything. What develops instead is trust. Trust in one's capacity to face inner material without collapse. Trust that confusion will reorganize. Trust that the psyche moves toward balance when given attention. This trust is earned. It develops through repetition. Each time the ego survives uncertainty, trust grows. Each time unconscious material is encountered without possession, confidence deepens. This confidence is quiet. It does not assert itself. It stabilizes behavior. Individuation also requires acceptance of limitation. The ego learns that not everything can be integrated at once. Some tensions remain unresolved. Some contradictions persist. This persistence is not a flaw. It reflects complexity. Jung believed that mature consciousness accepts complexity without demanding resolution. This acceptance reduces inner violence. The psyche becomes less polarized. Polarization produces exhaustion. Integration conserves energy. As individuation continues, the individual becomes less preoccupied with self-definition. Identity loosens. Life feels less like a performance and more like participation. Participation does not require constant evaluation. It allows presence. Presence is the simplest and most demanding expression of individuation. It means meeting experience as it unfolds, without immediate categorization or defense. Presence cannot be maintained permanently. It returns. Each return strengthens it. Jung believed that individuation deepens through repetition rather than breakthrough. There are no permanent states, only practice relationships with inner life. This understanding protects against disappointment. Disappointment arises when the ego expects permanence. Individuation offers movement. Movement keeps the psyche alive. A living psyche is not peaceful at all times. It is responsive. Responsiveness allows adaptation without self-erasure. Individuation, therefore, does not free a person from life's demands. It frees them from unnecessary internal conflict. The energy once spent fighting oneself becomes available for living. This availability is not dramatic, it is practical. Jung believed that the measure of individuation is not mystical experience or insight, but the ability to live with greater responsibility, flexibility, and honesty. These qualities do not attract attention. They sustain life. Individuation, practiced over time, creates a self that is neither rigid nor diffuse. The ego remains intact, but no longer dominant. The unconscious remains influential, but no longer overwhelming. This balance is dynamic. It must be maintained. Maintaining it is not work in the usual sense. It is attention. Attention to what disturbs. Attention to what attracts. Attention to what repeats. Through attention, the psyche continues to integrate itself. Not once. Continuously. That continuity is the true nature of individuation. not a transformation you complete, but a way of living that keeps you in dialogue with who you are becoming without demanding that becoming ever come to an end.